being talked about is because it's taboo, and also it's just not known. When we think of trafficking, we think of that movie Taken, or the one Sound of Freedom that just came out. And we think of these large container ships coming and docking, and then all these children being taken to hotels and sold. And while that does happen and that is trafficking, that is not what trafficking looks like in our communities. In our communities, it looks a lot more like relationships. It's women and men getting into relationships with people that they trust and people that they think love them. And what happens is these people have ulterior motives, and that is to make money. And so then they become exploited, and then they get stuck, and then they get scared because now they have what's called almost Stockholm syndrome, where they're not able to ask for help because asking for help makes them think that they could die, that they are under so much threat from this person that is controlling them, that it's better for them to just live in their oppressed experience than it is to ask for help. So that's kind of why Freekind exists. We are an organization that exists to prevent trafficking in our community, but also to support anyone who has experienced this so that they can experience freedom. We have, like I said, not just women, we also serve men as well. We have a few men on our caseload. Right now, I believe we have 175 people that we're serving. That's all throughout Hampton Roads, and we are expanding into Richmond. We started about 10 years ago as the Virginia Beach Justice Initiative, and it was started by an attorney who was working with women. And what he noticed is that a lot of these women were getting charges for possession, for identity theft, for prostitution, things that didn't quite add up. And so he dug a little further and he wanted to know, why do you have an addiction? Why do you feel like you can't give law enforcement your name when you're arrested? And what he discovered is beneath all that is a trafficker, is somebody who has essentially brainwashed that person into taking the charge, into not giving up that person. And so Pat McKenna was his name, the attorney that started our company here, and he fought for that. He stood up and he spoke to the courts and he spoke to the Commonwealth and he said, this is what's actually happening. And if we continue to allow this to happen, these women are not going to have a chance to get their lives back because they're getting felony charges. And once you have a felony on your record, it's impossible to get your credit report or get an apartment or get a job. And so we're actually damaging their opportunity to have their life back. And so Freekind came along and we developed sort of our three-prong approach to what we do. And that begins with awareness. That's me coming in, or one of the members of my organization, and talking to you and teaching you about trafficking and ways that you can get involved, how to spot it in your community. We also do industry-specific trainings. So we train a lot of our school resource officers. We train medical professionals. We train people in the school system. Anywhere you might come in contact with one of our clients, we are happy to train. We also do what we believe is, in order to stop what's happening, we have to go backwards and we have to touch the youngest generation. Because a lot of what we're seeing is that this is a generational impact that started with someone's great grandmother to grandmother to mother to child. Mothers are the number one traffickers of familial trafficking. How disturbing is that when you hear that? When I started this job, I went and I looked. I said, there is no way that is possible. It is. It is disturbing. And the reason for that is because it has been a generational pattern of acceptable behavior within that community or that family, and they were not allowed to ask for help. And so it just continued. Or there's an addiction that's underlying. And when you're in addiction, you don't have the capability to emotionally regulate and to make smart decisions. And so that's the other piece of that. So what we've done is created an SOL compliant curriculum. It's called the Prevention Project. And you do have a little pamphlet in there for that. And there's a little bit more information on this table as well. But this is an SOL compliant curriculum that we teach in 21 different states right now. In our community, I forget how many we have, but it's in some of our cities here. Not every city. We would love to be in every city. And the reason we do this is that 83% of those folks that have been identified as trafficking survivors told, it's Polaris, it's the national database, that their trafficking started between the ages of childhood and 23. So we have to start when they're younger. And this curriculum that we teach in the schools is about healthy relationships, how to protect yourself from your vulnerabilities, where you know I'm vulnerable, and how do I keep myself from being exploited. It sometimes can be taught along with like family life and that curriculum. It's been taught in the English classes, history classes, and I think that's all of them. But it's a wonderful, wonderful curriculum. I encourage you to read up about that. Last year alone, Freekind was able to help 67 new survivors in our community. We are 100% privately funded. We get no funding and resources from the state or the government. We are all church partners. We are local businesses that like to support us, and individuals who make contributions. So we're one of the few who gets no funding of that sort. We do apply for some grants, but again, they're not state grants and government grants. Last year, we helped 56 of our survivors enter long-term restorative programs. That is one of the things that we love to do, is to take a young lady or a gentleman and take them from their place of trafficking into a place of freedom where they can spend a year to 2 years of fully restoring themselves spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally, in a program that is protected, away from any awful influences or situations. And that happens I would say probably 2 to 3 times a month. We're usually taking people to programs. These are programs out of the state, a lot of them. We only have, I think, 1 or 2 in the state here locally that we use. Another part of my job is I do work directly with our survivors, so I'm on the front line, and part of that calls for me to go to court. It calls for me to testify on behalf of these young women and young men and work with their attorney to try to come up with an alternative sentence than being stuck in jail. And that looks like these restorative programs. It looks like connecting with community partners who are able to help them transition from jail into, say, working, into learning how to develop life skills, and then who provide trauma counseling. When we do advocate, we found last year that we had a 99% favorable outcome. So 99% of the time we were able to get a judge to see that what had happened to this person was not their choice, and that there were other options besides further incarceration. And what we're also finding is, because of this, the recidivism rates, that's then going back to jail, has decreased. It's not always true when addiction is involved, but we do find that if they have an alternative, they will find in favor of the alternative. We provided 760 instances of some direct support. So that's bringing food, that's bringing clothing, that's bringing toiletries, picking people up the day they get out of jail and making sure they don't end up back in the hands of their trafficker, taking them to the programs, providing bus passes, anything you can think of that would help somebody start their life over. That's what we call our direct support. Indirectly, we helped 238 instances of indirect support last year, and that can be some of that court advocacy. That's also working with, helping to restore licenses, helping to restore parental rights, connecting people with legal aid, kind of those outside projects there. So human trafficking, as we talked about, is not exactly what you've seen on TV. The federal definition of trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, soliciting, patronizing, or maintaining of a person for commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion. You only need to prove one of those things in order to be considered trafficking. Force is pretty simple. If anybody has ever been held against their will, physically assaulted, that's force. Fraud is what we see the most of. That is that deception of, I am your significant other, I'm your boyfriend, I love you greatly. They start a relationship, they start to exploit those boundaries and see how far they can get, and eventually they say, I've taken care of you, I've put food on your table, I've put clothing on your back and a roof over your head, now I need you to go get that money and pay me back. That's fraud, and that's what we experience a lot with our folks. And then coercion is the hardest part to break for someone. This is that psychological piece. This is the, if you don't do what I'm asking you to do, I will go after your children.
Yeah.
I will put you back on the street. I will call your probation officer and tell them that you're using drugs, so you go back to jail. These are different tactics that the traffickers will use to keep somebody in bondage. It is really important to know that in the United States, if you are under the age of 18, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. No such thing. It is automatically considered trafficking if you are involved in commercial sex acts as a minor. So if you come across a minor and you find out those things, the best thing to do is to turn that over to DSS or to our National Human Trafficking Hotline, which I'll provide you with all that stuff at the end. Did you know that trafficking is a $150 billion business? $150 billion on the backs and the souls of people who are just like you and me, who had a vulnerability, who didn't know what was happening until it happened. $99 billion of that is specifically from sex trafficking. That doesn't, it includes the labor trafficking as well, but that 99 billion is just from sex. And why we have that is because it all starts with a buyer. You have a buyer, and if you have a desire for something, somebody will meet that need. And so then you have your trafficker who comes along and figures out how to make money off of this. And then you have your victim. And it ends up, we call it the trafficking triad. And this just continues to happen as long as there is a buyer. So part of the prevention project is teaching children the ripple effect of buying sex. What it does is it creates this culture of, it's normalizing pornography, normalizing sexual experiences, kind of going outside of what God created us to be in community with our partners. And we we're able to share that in school in a way that is still honoring to God, because we are a faith-based organization, but it doesn't flood the system, if you know what I mean. Like, we can get in there, we can have these conversations, but it's not biblically based. And that need is, traffickers will identify the needs and vulnerabilities of their victims. And that looks like protection. If I find a young lady who has a potential, maybe they're being abused at home and they're scared, I'm going to offer her protection. I'm going to tell her, hey, come stay with me. I can protect you. If I see a young woman who maybe wants to model, I can exploit her there. I can say, oh, you're beautiful. You would be really cute in some pictures. And then let me take a couple pictures of you. I can exploit somebody through adventure. Maybe they had a really rough upbringing, and I'm going to offer them the opportunity of travel, or I'm going to offer them the opportunity of a business deal. You can make a lot of money doing this. And then probably the two most difficult ones, but the ones that lure people the most, are home and love.
Yeah.
Foster children are one of our number one exploited clients that we work with. These foster kids have been tied to a paycheck since day one. So they have equated themselves with transactional love.
Wow.
It is not beyond the scope of them to experience what that means as being trafficked. And then that love piece. It is, if you are a child who has experienced sexual assault as a child, exploit or neglect, your attachments are not what they should be to form a healthy relationship. And so you're going to get yourself into a situation where if someone talks nicely to you, if someone, we call it love bombing, if someone love bombs you, that feels so good that you will do anything. And so that's something that we see a lot with a lot of our folks. I'm sure you've heard the term grooming before, right? Okay. So the best way that anyone has ever described grooming to me was the gradual expansion of boundaries and increased in trust and dependence. Just think of that for a minute. Consider your own boundaries. Where are your boundaries and your values? Now, if you had a vulnerability, you had a parent who was absent, a parent who was in jail, a parent who was addicted, if you experienced sexual assault, if you grew up in the foster system, if you were in juvenile justice, these are all what we call trauma indicators that can set somebody up to have their boundaries expanded and exploited. And so part of that prevention project is, again, recognizing what my vulnerabilities are so I don't become exploited. But what they do is they start very carefully. They target the victim. They develop the trust. They gain important information about that victim. Facebook. I can learn anything I want to know about you on Facebook. And then I can make this relationship with you and say, you know, I